Okay, let's dive into this incredible collection of sources you've given us today. We're sort of peeling back the layers on these historical ethnographic accounts.
Yeah, they describe various castes and communities from South India.
It's like looking through a fascinating window, isn't it?
Yeah.
Into this really complex social tapestry.
It really is. These records capture such distinct ways of life, customs, beliefs. It's quite something.
Absolutely. Our mission with this deep dive really is to navigate these diverse groups, try and pull out some of the most surprising, maybe insightful nuggets from the material.
And understand what they tell us about the social landscape back then, at least as seen through the eyes of these
Thanks.
observers.
Exactly. And hopefully share some stories you might not expect. Get ready for that.
Oh, the sources definitely deliver on the unexpected details. They don't shy away.
Let's start right there then. In the heart of village life, some specific roles and communities described.
Okay.
One figure that immediately jumps out is the Karnam, the village accountant, especially in the Telugu districts.
Ugh, yes, the Karnam. The way the source describes him is pretty striking. Intelligent, it says, but also the most unpopular man.
Feared and hated even,
Hmm.
with murders apparently not unknown. That's intense.
It is. And what's really insightful are the proverbs the source includes. They really hammer it home.
Like that one, even if 1,000 pagodas are levied from a village, not even a cash will be levied from the Karnam.
Right. That speaks volumes, doesn't it? About the perception of their power, their ability to maybe avoid the burdens everyone else faced. Hints at corruption, maybe?
It positions them sort of outside the system, financially anyway.
And the other proverb is even, well, more chilling. The Karnam is the cause of the copper's death, the Kapu being the cultivator caste.
Wow. So this isn't just like a minor complaint about a local official. These proverbs feel like real evidence of how people saw power and, frankly, danger in the village structure.
Maybe more feared than distant rulers sometimes. It really makes you think about local power dynamics.
Okay, so moving away from the settled villages for a moment, let's go up into the hills. The sources talk about the Kotas, a hill tribe.
The Kotas. They're noted for their skills as blacksmith, making tools for other tribes, and even, it says, for European planters.
Yeah, but what really grabs my attention with the Kotas, though, is the description of their diet.
Ah, yes. It's described quite, let's say, bluntly, including carrion.
And it specifically mentions seeing someone carrying home a dead rat.
That detail is certainly vivid, but it's crucial here. The source itself includes complexity. It actually quotes a Kota informant who just flatly denies it, says, the book tells lies.
Which is fascinating in itself, that internal contradiction. It tells us something important about these historical accounts, doesn't it? The challenges, potential biases.
Exactly. Whose truth are we reading? And then, despite calling the diet unpleasant, the observer also notes it evidently agrees with the Kotas, who are a sturdy set of people.
So you get this judgment maybe from the outsider, but it's immediately countered, both by the person from the community and by the observer's own eyes, saying, hey, they look healthy.
Right. It's a good reminder to read critically.
The Kotas also had a specific priesthood with rules like priests couldn't be widowers.
And that curious taboo about cow's milk. They couldn't drink it, even though the source says they could eat cow's flesh. Strange distinction.
Their ceremonies apparently involved feasting with neighbors, the Badagas, and these joint dances. Notch is the term used sometimes with other tribes.
Marriage sounds simple enough, involving a dowry, but they had this unique ritual after birth, placing twigs from 5 different thorny plants.
Details like that really paint a picture, and their funeral customs sound quite elaborate.
Yeah, prostration, a wild sort of step dance, music, burning the body on a pyre and distributing things, tobacco, cigars, cloth, grain.
It gives you a sense of a community really marking that transition, that loss, with significant effort and sharing.
Okay, shifting back to village crafts now. The potters. They're described under a couple of names, Kumbaro and Kusavan, depending on the region.
And they offer some fascinating insights, particularly how their craft and beliefs were, totally intertwined.
With the Kumbaras, in some areas, they actually officiated as priests for local deities, even demons, and performed funeral rites.
Which is pretty unusual, isn't it?
Yeah.
Often those roles are very separate. And unlike some other potter groups, these Kumbaras didn't wear the sacred thread, a big deal in Hindu society.
Infant and widow marriages were also noted as common among them.
And there's a specific purification ritual mentioned after a birth. It involves the barber and the washerman, using holy water from the temple.
Shows how these different service castes were all woven into the fabric of life cycle events. Essential.
And a local goddess, Kanthama,
Mm-hmm.
protecting fishing folk. You see that connection again. Craft, place, belief, environment.
They even had a practical tip noted down, polishing pots using juice from the toothy plant.
Now, the Kusavans, another potter group. They had this origin story, tracing descent from Kulalan, who was apparently a son of Brahma.
And the story goes that Brahma gave him the power to create and destroy daily, just like Brahma himself. They were known for making those big, ancient burial urns.
The description of their craft is almost poetic, molding clay with easy sweeps into beautiful curves.
But the really striking detail, I think, is their religious practice right there at the wheel, worshipping the lump of clay before they start working.
Seeing it as a lingam or as Ganesha, key Hindu forms.
And the source points out this wasn't just potters. Salt factory workers did something similar, making a little Ganesh figure from the salt heap before starting work.
It just highlights how deeply embedded religious thought was in everyday work, in interacting with materials. It wasn't separate. The stuff itself could be sacred.
Yeah, not just about going to the temple.
Some Kusavan families specialized in making these painted hollow clay images, including figures for couples who wanted female children, taken as offerings to temples.
And clay horses, set up in fields to drive away demons or as thang offerings, often linked to the deity Ayanar.
Their marriage customs sound interesting too. The groom's sister ties the tally, the marriage pendant.
And that ritual with sowing seeds in a pot, then throwing them into water, symbolizing fertility, perhaps? Divorce and remarriage were allowed?
But then there's a tougher side noted. The source mentions potter's gangrene.
Right, resulting from how village potters apparently treated fractures with really tight splinting, often led to amputation.
It's a sobering reminder, isn't it? These accounts aren't just about quaint customs. They capture the harsh realities of health and, well, medicine at the time.
Definitely. Okay, shifting again. The Kuruvikrans, a Marathi-speaking group, known mostly as bird catchers and beggars.
They also hunted jackals, apparently. Made bags from the skin, ate the flesh.
And they had this curious belief in the jackal's horn, thought it brought luck.
Found on small jackals that drank dew on full moon nights. Sounds pretty specific.
Yeah, and the source adds, rather dryly, that fake horns were quickly stolen. Suggests maybe the belief was known and exploited.
They use whistles and snares for catching birds. But what really stands out to me is the description of their marriage ceremony.
The promises, right. Surprisingly explicit.
Yes. The fathers exchanging vows about kindness. Do not beat her when she is ill. If she cannot carry water, you should help her.
And then the bride and groom directly to each other, promising fidelity. I am true, I have not smiled at any girl. Your daughter should not smile at any man.
I mean, that level of direct public declaration about faithfulness and behavior is quite remarkable, isn't it?
It really is. Very specific expectations laid out right there.
Okay, so we've looked at some communities tied to village crafts, specific roles. Let's turn our focus now to some of the communities living in the hill and forest areas.
Right. Life there presented different challenges and often fostered different traditions, different beliefs.
The Khois, for example, also known as Koya or Cree. The sources link them to the Gons.
But note a difference in diet. Some Gons considered good caste, avoided pork or mutton. But the Khoi, like another group called the Doms, were described as eating, well, anything he can get, from a rat to a cow.
And historically, it sounds like they suffered quite a bit. The source mentions forced labor, carrying things for zamindars, local rulers, and rohillas.
And having to provide their own food money, bata, while doing it. That's rough.
They were also victims of robbery, plunder. Khoi women frequently stripped, the source says.
That level of insecurity meant they often hid their grain in caves up in trees.
There's even a story of a violent raid. A headman trying to forcibly carry off a rich widow for his son.
They also have this tradition of being driven from a plateau area by famine, by disputes.
Described as semi-nomadic farmers, exhausting the soil in about 4 years, then moving on.
The ipa tree was really important. They ate the flowers. And the source links it to their drunkenness, suggesting maybe alcohol made from it was a big part of social life.
What's really complex, though, is how the source describes their character. It's full of contradictions.
It is. On one hand, they excite admiration by their truthfulness and simplicity, never breaking their word.
But then also draw contempt by their drunkenness, listlessness, and want of thrift.
And it adds amusement by their stupidity and timidity and self-importance, and even disgust by their uncanny superstitions and thinly veiled bloodthirstiness.
Wow. That kind of contradictory portrayal, like we saw with the Kotas diet maybe, it probably tells us as much about the observer's biases or perspective as it does about the Khois themselves.
Absolutely. It's a strong reminder to read these historical accounts with a critical eye. Who is speaking, and why are they using these words?
Their marriage customs involve getting consent with gifts, money, and liquor, but sometimes followed by bride capture.
Often when the woman was out fetching water or wood, or alone.
And here's a detail that just creates such a visual image, a highlight of the wedding, if the families were wealthy.
The mother-in-law carrying the new son-in-law on her shoulders.
Can you imagine? Or the maternal aunt if the mother couldn't.
Mhm.
What a moment of, I don't know, ritual inversion, public acceptance.
Yeah. Definitely memorable. Death ceremonies involved a pollution period. A feast often sacrificed beef and merrymaking.
On the 8th day, they'd place a pot of water for the soul, a cow sacrifice on the 9th.
They also had specific sacrifice rituals, pouring water over sheep, looking for shivering as a sign the deity approved.
Interesting detail. The worshippers eat the sacrifice, but their wives weren't allowed to. Specific gender roles in ritual consumption.
They propitiated a demoness, Peta, in December. Generally seemed distant from Hindu temples, though some worshipped Shiva and Vima, sacrificing a cow or pig for rain.
Ancestral worship was clearly very important, centered around the Velpu.
Right, that three-cornered cloth with ancestor figures, adding a new one for every important man who died, carried around yearly for offerings.
They had rules for planting a sacred tree, setting up a stone for a goddess, Kodalama, even used cockpecking for divination, trying to foresee if the year would be lucky.
And this pervasive fear mentioned, that envious people would use demons against them.
Which led them to wear scanty attire, believing it made them less vulnerable.
Yeah, that a belief could influence something as basic as clothing choices is pretty fascinating, isn't it? Shows how deeply these fears could run.
Okay, the Kurumbas, another fascinating hill tribe in the sources. Various types mentioned.
Yes, Kadu or hill Kurumbas and Genu or honey Kurumbas. Different characteristics, different jobs.
Kadu Kurumbas had their own barbers, using broken glass as razors. That detail speaks volumes about resourcefulness, maybe isolation.
Female dress was coarse cloth, tattooing mentioned, and a notable custom. Strangers had to take off their shoes in their hamlets, a sign of respect for their space.
After death, children were buried, adults burned, and they'd abandon a whole village site after an untoward event.
Suggests a strong belief in avoiding bad luck, maybe spiritual contamination associated with a place where something bad happened.
The source describes them as active, tough, able to endure fatigue, and revengeful, but if treated kindly, they will do willing service. Again, you hear the observer's voice there.
They had this really complex relationship with the neighboring Badagas, paying them tribute, working for them.
But despite this sort of subservient position, the Kurumbas were widely feared as diviners, as sorcerers.
And the source recounts chilling instances of Kurumbas being murdered because of these suspicions, accused of causing misfortune, disease, death through necromancy.
It notes 48 murders in 1835 alone, a whole family killed in 1900. And the source states that the sympathies of the whole Badaga village were with the murderers.
That's deeply disturbing. It highlights the brutal real-world consequences that fear and superstition could have, beliefs leading directly to violence.
Yet they were also valued for very practical skills. European sportsmen apparently relied on Kurumba trackers.
Who had this incredible ability, it says, to spot honey just by seeing a single bee fly past. Amazing knowledge of the forest.
They also had a unique way of making fire, using reciprocal hand motion with sticks.
And the Nayaka Kurumbas are described as forest nomads who were afraid of white men, women and children hiding when they appeared. Another echo of potentially negative historical interactions or fear of outsiders.
Finally, among these hill groups, the Malaiyalis, living on hill summits, described as suspicious and superstitious.
But the source gives a reason for this suspicion, which is telling. They feared the researchers were actually government settlement officers.
Coming to survey their land, maybe take it, and transport them to the Andaman Islands, which was a penal colony.
They even mistook cameras for surveying instruments. That level of distrust, likely born from past experiences or rumors, is quite revealing about their relationship with outside authorities.
They trace their descent from Velars who conquered the hills, symbolized by planting an arrow in the marriage booth.
Their relationships with other castes, like Palan and Tadian, involved complex kinship terms and legends. like that story about why Tautian women were cold, blaming the Malaiyalis for supposedly selling their sister. History and myth intertwined.
Land ownership was a big source of conflict. Planters reportedly used Malaiyalis to get land outside designated areas, bypassing rules, showing how external economic forces impacted local dynamics.
Festival adornments included pink coal tar dyes, probably a trade good in wild plants. Processions had brass figures of deities, Draupadi, Perumal, Kali, carried in chariots, people throwing offerings.
And a really striking ritual, the bull-catching ceremony during Pongal. Lots of people holding a rope attached to a bull, pulling against one man at the front. A test of strength, communal effort.
And this one, during a hunting festival, if the headman, the polyagar, failed to bring down any game.
His top knot, his kudumi, was cut off by the priest, the pujari.
Talk about high stakes, a very public, probably humiliating consequence for failing a ritual duty tied to the community's prosperity.
Their social structure included these headmen, palayagar, batakaran, and village councils, panchayats that could impose fines, local governance.
They followed different inheritance patterns, including patrilineal, depending on the specific group.
Marriage customs varied. There's a note about a young boy marrying a grown woman, though the source clarifies the father didn't step in as husband.
And wives could leave husbands for a lover within the caste, with the husband keeping the children. Specific rules for dissolving marriages, polygamy was practiced.
Betrothal involved gifts to the bride's father. They worshipped Vishnu and Siva, had village temples for Perumal and Kali.
And dream appearances by evil spirits or ghosts prompted rituals like, get this, having your hair nailed to a tree trunk and then cut off. A dramatic physical act to, sever the connection, ward off the spirit. Really powerful imagery there. Okay, so let's delve a bit deeper now into the social structure itself, particularly the relationships and tensions between the Mallas and Mappillas.
Right, they're central to the source's discussion of these left-hand and right-hand caste divisions.
The sources flat out say they were often quarreling, even recount specific incidents like a disturbance because a Mappilla wore a red cloth and processed down a main street leading to violence.
But despite this tension, they often shared crucial roles in village festivals, which shows a really complex mix, doesn't it? Conflict, but also interdependence.
Absolutely. Village goddess festivals are described in fascinating detail, and both Mallas and Mappillas were heavily involved.
At Alor, for instance, a Mappilla pujari, a priest, beheaded the buffaloes for the sacrifice.
And rice soaked in the blood was sprinkled through the streets on houses by Mappillas, shouting, "Poli, poli," meaning food.
And the detail here is specific. Only Mallas and Mappillas shouted. Others followed silently. Why? Because noise or lights were thought to attract evil spirits.
The cart with the goddess and offerings was dragged with music, then left outside the town limits. And the Mallas and Mappillas, often called pariahs in this context, took the sacrificed animals and fruits. It was their traditional right, their payment, perhaps.
There was another powerful festival described to avert evil or maybe respond to crop failure. For Padama or Sankalana.
Again, involves sacrificing a buffalo with a Mappilla doing the beheading.
And a really striking part, a naked Mega wearing only margosa leaves, leading a procession with lamps on heads, followed by others sacrificing sheep and goats.
These rituals sound incredibly visceral. They highlight the central, maybe dangerous but essential roles these groups played in communal well-being, in dealing with the sacred and the dangerous forces.
The Mappillas also had female priestesses called matangi, often from the prostitute class, the source says.
They were unmarried but not bound by celibacy and held in respect. The source even notes Brahmins regarded their spitting on devotees as auspicious.
Which feels like a remarkable inversion of the usual hierarchy, doesn't it?
Completely. These matangis presided over purification ceremonies, performed a possessed dance.
Mappilla men called asadas also had an initiation. They were musicians, singing stories about the goddess Alama, playing a specific instrument called a shodak.
The source also describes the Mappillas' traditional economic role, tied to the Ryot families, the cultivators.
Receiving dead animals from the village, and being paid in kind grain, usually for supplying leather goods for agriculture, like ropes, sandals, buckets.
Finding their own leather for smaller things, but the master providing hides for bigger items like water buckets. A clearly defined relationship.
Interestingly, though, urban Mappillas are noted as having gained wealth from the skin trade, suggesting economic changes were maybe altering those traditional roles and status.
Their origin legend involves Jambu, or Adi Jambuvadu, and a story about how they fell to their current position because of a curse related to tasting milk from the sacred cow Kamadhinu.
And some Mappilla children were given names signifying humility, like Burial ground, rock, rubbish heap, begging.
Based on the belief this would ensure a long life, by sort of preempting fate, not attracting attention.
Yet, despite all this, they proudly claimed, Memu pede inti valamu. We are of the big house.
That mix is fascinating, isn't it? Practices perhaps stemming from perceived low status alongside the strong claim of historical significance or belonging, a real contradiction within their identity as described.
Now, the Lingayats, including Lingabalicha, who were traders, and Jangam, the priestly class, discuss with different accounts of their origin the role of Basava founder or reviver.
Yeah, the sources don't quite agree, and one census account mention makes this, well, controversial claim that Lingayatism wasn't originally anti-Brahmanical.
And didn't abolish caste, asserting its basis in a selective use of the Vedas.
Which goes against the common understanding. While the ideal might have initially been to raise all castes, allow eating together, intermarriage, the source says social distinctions kind of reasserted themselves.
For example, it notes a pariah or mala couldn't be initiated. Limits were there.
A central practice, of course, is wearing the sifalingam, often in a little case, and it must be tied on a child's neck by the 10th day for them to be considered a linga balija. Very specific.
Unlike most Hindus, they shave their whole heads, no top knot, no kudumi, and put sacred ashes on their foreheads daily.
Yeah.
They also deny reincarnation, metempsychosis.
Strict customs, too. No liquor, no meat, and they always eat privately.
But here's a detail that really highlights that tension between strict rules and, well, real life.
The traitor.
Yes. The source notes, quite strikingly, that some Orthodox Lingayat traders admitted to removing their lingam for business deals.
Because, in their words, it is necessary to tell little falsehoods.
Wow. That admission is incredibly insightful, isn't it? Shows the pressure points where religious rules met economic necessity. What do you do when your fate clashes with making a living?
A very human dilemma. They also had conflicts with Brahmins over certain practices, like displaying symbols related to the deity Nandi or ringing bells in processions, which Brahmins saw as offensive.
Their social governance included excommunication being put into Coventry, as the source puts it, lifted by paying a fine to their guru.
Marriage involved both infant and adult arrangements, parties having practically no choice, suggesting strong family control. Widow remarriage was allowed, but stricter members frowned on it.
The source also touches on their farming practices, auspicious days for plowing, sowing, rain predictions based on constellations.
Other groups get mentioned more briefly, but still add to the picture. The Kotas.
Right. Apparently hard to distinguish from Brahmins in appearance and ceremonies, leading to sad instances of Brahmin girls being decoyed into matrimonial alliances.
Their position traced to a curse by Sankaracharya for changing occupation. Again, these origin stories explaining current status.
The Malaiyalis cultivators, fishermen, hunters, had two endogamous divisions, one where the sacred thread wouldn't eat with the other, internal distinctions even within smaller groups.
And the Malaiyalis, sometimes called Balajangam, linking them to Lingayats. But Malairi is also listed as an exogamous sept, a group you marry out of within the Mallas.
Shows how complex and sometimes overlapping, maybe even contradictory, these social labels could be on the ground. Not always neat categories.
Okay, let's step back from the big structures for a minute and look at some of the specific rituals and beliefs. They give such a glimpse into the spiritual lives, the ways people tried to cope with the world.
We touched on the Khois and their Velpu cloth for ancestor worship. The Kuruvas also practiced ancestor worship.
And showed reverence for certain trees like Jami and Ashwatham by not cutting them. They worshipped a goddess, Humbalama, secretly at night.
Magical beliefs and practices seem to run through many of these accounts, don't they?
Definitely. The Kudubis had magicians, Gardi, for illness, snake bites, using leaves, magical powers, also known as snake charmers, believed to influence wild animals.
The Kudavas had exorcists, Rarocker. They'd become possessed to diagnose diseases, naming mountain deities responsible.
And as we discussed with the Krumbas, that widespread fear of their necromancy, believed to cause misfortune, death, leading to actual violence against them.
Shows how potent these beliefs about magic could be. Real tragic consequences. Mallas and Mappillas also engaged in rituals to ward off evil, seek favor.
Death ceremonies, too, often involved really complex rituals, beliefs about the afterlife, the spirit world.
The Kotas funeral dance and distributing goods, a significant communal event.
The Khois offering water and sacrificing a cow for the soul-specific actions to help the deceased.
And the Mallas had various rituals, tearing the cloth over the face, breaking a cooking pot before burial for Saivites.
The son walking around the grave with a leaky pot, not looking back, symbolic acts, maybe severing ties, guiding the spirit, preventing its return.
The widow ceremony, too, removing jewels, breaking bracelets, a physical marking of her changed status, her grief.
Rituals aimed at controlling nature, seeking good fortune are also common. The Kois, using cockpecking for divination about the year ahead.
The Mallas performing that frog ceremony for rain, carrying a frog in a basket with neem leaves, villagers pouring water. Sympathetic magic, right? Mimicking the rain they needed.
And the Lingayats with their agricultural auguries, looking for signs in lightning and wind during certain constellations, hoping for good crops, different ways of trying to influence or predict nature.
But perhaps some of the most, well, intense rituals described are those of the Malaiyalis.
Ah, yes! They perform Tiatam masks, song, dance, music.
But more dramatically, the Uchaveli ceremony, described in the source as either survivals or imitations of human sacrifice.
Involving a mock living burial, the main performer put into a pit.
And the Nanaveli, a bloody sacrifice ritual. The performer smears their body with red paste flour, lime, and parched paddy, representing smallpox boils.
After these incredibly intense performances, the performer often feigned exhaustion, was drenched with water, a kind of ritual cleansing or return.
And the source notes the Uchaveli disguise, the mock burial one, was also used when human sacrifice was considered necessary, suggesting it served as a symbolic substitute for an even more brutal practice.
These rituals are incredibly powerful to read about, hinting at deep beliefs about appeasement, transformation, maybe communal catharsis through extreme performance.
Malaiyalis also served historically as bearers of death announcements, a somber but vital role connecting communities.
And the Mandala Varu, described as nomadic medicine men, thieves, beggars, selling packets of powders, ground stones, wood, fruits as remedies.
Paints a picture of a mobile group, maybe living on the margins, with a mix of traditional healing and perhaps other means of survival.
Okay, finally, let's look briefly at groups with stronger links to trade, to coastal life, particularly the Mohammedan communities mentioned.
The Lambadis, right? Described as Mohammedan merchants, traders, skin dealers, petty shopkeepers, beetle growers.
What's particularly interesting is that some Lambadis, the Kodi Kalkaran Lambadis, seem to have adopted some Hindu customs into their marriage ceremonies.
Like setting up a milk post, tying a tali, the Hindu marriage pendant, while Mohammedan rites were also performed, a kind of blending or syncretism.
Then there are the Mappillas, a significant Mohammedan population, especially in Malabar, the Lacadive Islands.
Their origin legends vary. Descent from Arab traders, pilgrims maybe, possibly incorporating local converts like Nambudris used as envoys.
Described as having strong enthusiasm for religious practices, divided into Sunni and Shia sects, with disputes mentioned.
Their religious leaders, the Tangals, held huge influence, inspiring absolute loyalty, the source says, capable of absolving crimes, offering asylum in mosques.
There's even a legend on Kavaratti Island that a Tangal cursed the crows, and that's why there are none there. Shows the power attributed to them.
Their mosque architecture is noted as unique, often lacking minarets, resembling local temple styles, another hint of regional cultural influence.
The source also details a history of what it terms fanatical outbreaks, massacres, defiance of authorities, leading to specific harsh legislation.
Laws allowing property confiscation, fining whole areas, making the Mappilla war knife illegal.
The murder of Mr. Connolly while collecting these knives is specifically recounted. Legends of martyrs, supernatural aid in battle also circulated within the community, framing these conflicts differently, no doubt.
But despite this history of conflict reported in the source, it also highlights efforts to improve Mappilla education and their economic activity.
Described as having grit, laboriousness, and enterprise, reclaiming dense forest, marshland for farming, sought after as hard workers.
Physical differences noted between coastal and inland Mappillas, less Arab ancestry seen inland. Women often secluded, especially upper classes.
Jewelry was important. Women wearing lots of earrings, needing many holes pierced in the ear rim. Specific marriage signs like gujari pendants.
And notably, many Mappillas, particularly in the north, had adopted Marumakafayam, that's inheritance through the female line, before converting to Islam.
Shows how pre-conversion social structures could persist. Dowries were expected to be large in North Malabar, where husbands were at a premium.
Death ceremonies are detailed. Mullahs reading the Quran, visits to the tomb, feasts, yearly ceremonies.
And the Lacadive Island Mappillas had their own internal divisions based on occupation, history landowners, sailors, descendants of former slaves.
Wow. What an incredibly rich, diverse, and sometimes challenging picture emerges from these historical accounts.
It really is a mosaic, isn't it?
From the feared village accountant, the Karnam, whose position was literally life and death according to those proverbs, to the Kurumbas, suspected of necromancy, living with the constant threat of violence.
The bull-catching Malaiyalis, marking ritual failure with a public haircut. The complex dance of conflict and shared ritual between Mallas and Mappillas.
The rule-bound Lingayats, navigating faith in business. That trader removing his lingam. And the dynamic Mappillas, with their unique history, that blend of traditions and reported conflicts.
These sources, even acknowledging they reflect the viewpoints and limits of their time, they reveal a world just teeming with unique customs, truly surprising beliefs, and the resilience of communities finding their way.
We've encountered tales of magic, conflict, negotiation between old ways and new pressures, just daily life.
Yeah.
It really highlights the depth and complexity captured in these records.
It forces you to look beyond simple labels, doesn't it? Appreciate the intricate layers of social life, spiritual practice, historical experience.
So what does this incredible mosaic mean for you listening? Well, perhaps it's a powerful reminder of the sheer diversity, the complexity that can exist even within one region.
It certainly makes you think about how traditions evolve, how conflict arises sometimes from material things, sometimes from deeply held beliefs.
And how those beliefs, even when they seem contradictory to us now, shaped people's lives, their actions in really profound ways.
Exactly. So consider this as we wrap up. How do these specific, sometimes jarring, details the Karnam's proverbs showing fear of local power, not just distant rulers? The Kota informant saying, the book tells lies, right there in the source.
The potter worshipping the clay itself. The Kuruvikaran's incredibly explicit marriage vows. The source's contradictory description of the Kois. The deadly fear surrounding the Kurumbas.
The Malaiyalis seeing cameras as survey tools because they feared deportation. The Mappillas' status mixed with that proud claim of being from the big house.
The Lingayat trader making that compromise with his lingam for business, or those intense malice or rituals, the mock human sacrifice.
How do these details, challenging as they might be, force us to reconsider what we think we know about historical societies, about the diverse, sometimes bewildering ways people have made sense of their world?
It really leaves you thinking about the layers of meaning, the human stories behind these practices and beliefs, doesn't it?